Hello, everyone. This is the Vice President of Internet Infidels, Edouard Tahmizian. You know me for my two published papers. One of them's in book form in Essays for the Secular Web on Amazon Prime. And today, for the seventh time, I'm going to be interviewing the one and only legendary Dr. John Dominic Crossan, who has a couple of national
Seventh time.
bestsellers, and he used to be the co-chair of the famous Jesus Seminar. And before we begin the questions, I'll let you do any self-promotions you want, or if you have any lectures coming up, you can talk to us about that. So take it away, Dr. Crossan.
And the main thing actually I want to plug, if you want, promote, is my book on Paul the Pharisee. Not just because, of course, I want to promote it, but because that's going to be the basis of everything I answer about Paul. The consensus of scholars, as you know, is you have to see Paul as a Jew. I agree completely, but that doesn't tell me very much. It tells me a lot. He's a Pharisee. That's a very, very special type of Jew in the first century. And to understand Paul, that's going to be my argument. You must understand him as a Pharisaic Jew. So that's my plug for the book Paul the Pharisee. That's why it's called.
Yeah, aptly called. All
Yes.
right. Beginning with our first question. By the time Paul had his Damascus experience of Jesus of Nazareth appearing to him, it had been about a year and a half since Jesus died. By the time he stopped murdering Christians, they had already been trying to argue from the Old Testament that Jesus was the true Messiah. They probably would have used texts like Psalm 22:16, Isaiah chapter 53, and Zechariah 12:10 to show Jesus fulfilled these alleged messianic prophecies. It's debatable whether Jesus was given an honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea, but if his tomb was found empty, the Christians would have used that evidence as well to show Jesus supernaturally rose from the dead. Yet for a long time, Paul remained unconvinced that Jesus was really the Messiah despite all of that evidence, and it took no other than Jesus appearing in front of him, or so he thought, to be convinced of the central Christian claim. So my question, Dr. Crossan, is why did Paul not believe Jesus was the Messiah while some others did?
Okay, in general, Ed, what I'm going to do today to tell yourself and our viewers, I'm going to put up certain visuals and discuss them in answer. I've lined up my visuals with the questions which you've sent me. So let me put the first one up. I'm going to share screen. This is the theory, at least. All right, hold up that for the moment, because here in a way, I'm going to start with a counter question. Before you can ask why did Paul not believe, you have to ask what did Paul know? And when did he know it? Sounds like that old question. What did Paul know? In other words, what was available for him? I can't go into his mind. I can ask what was available. Now, a couple of things I'm going to pick on your question. They're not the term murderous. No, no. No matter what Paul might have wanted to do, the Roman Empire had a monopoly on murder in the first century. So when you read, for example, when you read Luke Acts, which you should read with very great caution, by the way, and he's acting as a persecutor in Jerusalem. He's doing so great. The high priest sent him all the way to Damascus for a rendition trip to bring people back. That's not even historical fiction. It's rubbish. There is no way, no way under heaven or under the Roman Empire that the high priests had that type of authority, much beyond the temple, to put it bluntly, and their influence, of course, on people. Yeah, the Syrian governor, the Syrian legate would have something to say, and the Nabatean people around Damascus would have something to say about Paul come galloping in for his rendition. So let's be very careful about leave out all that murderous stuff. He might have wanted to do it, and of course, where I see him, by the way, is I see him starting in Damascus, not starting in Jerusalem. That's Lukács's great theme. Everything must start from Jerusalem. So Paul does too. I think he was brought up in Tarsus. I see no reason to doubt Luke on that. And I think he went to Damascus for his for his university education, if you wanted. That's where he became a Pharisee. And I see him as the enforcer of orthodoxy in the synagogue or the synagogues of Damascus. Does that mean he's a nasty person if he wants to be? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Because if he fires you from the synagogue, he can't kill you, but he can fire you from the synagogue and you fall between worlds. You're not quite a Gentile, you're not quite a Jew. If you're in business relationships, yeah, he could destroy you economically. So, yeah, it's when he says he persecuted, I take it very seriously. It's like an authority today in the church who gets you fired and you can't get a job. Oh, yeah, he can destroy a person. Now, let me hold on to all of that because the problem I see in the question is, if I can put it crudely and rudely, it's as if you imagine Paul having read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and kind of figuring out, why don't I believe it? Come back with me, say, to the 50s. The 50s. Now, that's before Mark or Matthew or Luke or John or any of those people. I'd put a date on it, the year 60, certainly before the Great War. What were there? There were two early written gospels. Before the four that we know about, imagine yourself not knowing the four. You're in the year 60. You have the gospel according to Q, let's call it that. Q, as your audience, I sure know, I'm assured probably. It's the source used by Matthew and Luke apart from Mark. If you don't think it exists, that's your privilege. I think it does, and therefore I build on it as you will build on its absence if somebody doesn't. The gospel according to Q and the gospel according to Paul. We have two written gospels. Paul, you'd have to put together, of course, out of his letters, but we have two. So if Paul knows anything, and I'm not imagining him reading the gospel according to Q in manuscript, but the sort of stuff that's in it. Look down at what I say. It's basically chosen to speak of the life of Jesus. Excuse me. It's Jesus the Lord, by the way. The life of Jesus the Lord. Now, I do not mean this is pure history or anything like that. Of course, it's theology. It sees Jesus the Lord as speaking, revealing, incarnating the wisdom of God out of the Old Testament tradition. And what happens whenever the wisdom of God appears? It gets killed probably or refused or something. So the life is what Paul would know about, the wisdom. Now, Paul decides, and we're going to talk more about that in the next hour, that that doesn't interest him. I'm going to put it that way. Anything he hears about it, I think Paul might say quite bluntly to you, well, I've read the prophets and I know the Torah. What's this guy you're talking about, this Jesus guy? What's he said that Isaiah didn't? What's new in what he's saying? Now, if somebody knows enough, they might talk about nonviolent resistance and all the rest of it. But Paul's going to say, I'm interested in the death of Jesus. Now, I'm going to ask you, my audience here, please don't read Anselm back into Paul. The death of Jesus is the death of Jesus, the Messiah Christ. And that's what sears the soul of Paul. How on earth was the Messiah put to death? Why did God allow it? And his own answer is because it reveals the unjust violence of civilization. That's why God let the Messiah be killed and knew from all eternity it would happen. Because civilization executed the Lord Messiah and thereby revealed its own violence, savagery. And of course, if it knew what it was doing, it wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory, as he says. They blew it. It's like somebody today who does something awful. I'm hesitating to use an example, and thereby reveals the savagery that is present. Let's say some institution does something appalling, and we begin to see, that's not just one bad apple, as it were. That's the whole orchard. So, therefore, By the 50s, you had these two options: the life of Jesus, the wisdom. I'm going to sneeze, I think. The death of Jesus, the Messiah Christ. Excuse me, excuse me. Now, what Mark does, and I am not saying he's read Paul, and I'm not saying he's read Q. Mark sees these two great emphases, the life and the death, and the brilliance of Mark. And I know it's brilliant because everyone had to copy him. Nobody came up with a different form of the gospel, at least it was canonized. If I put together the life of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, and all of that, and the death and resurrection of Jesus, I have a gospel that can stand up to the gospel of Caesar. It's a story, it's a life story. So the great genius of Mark was to do that, to take these emphases on life and death, put them together. Matthew copied it, added, of course, so did Luke, and I think so did John. Nobody ever came up with a different one. The others were still there, of course. In the second century, you had the Revelation, Gnostic Gospels, but this was the one that was canonized to take on the Roman Empire. And quite frankly, it worked. So let me go to another one I want to look at for the moment. This is to give you a wider matrix.
Mhm.
Around the time of the Maccabean martyrs, let's say 160s in BCE, of course, there was a huge change in the biblical tradition from salvation, deliverance before death, like you get Daniel in the lion's den and three men in the fiery furnace. You pray to God, God intervenes, Zappo, you're home safe. Now that didn't work too well with the Maccabean martyrs. So what's up? Where's justice? The great answer is after death. That's the huge Deuteronomic shift, if you will. I give you some examples there of it. Now, here's what's so important for Paul. Hugely important. Within that after death option, there were in the first century two other sub options, if you will. One is individual ascension, apotheosis. In the Roman world and the Jewish world, if somebody had been a very holy person or a very powerful general or a very great philosopher, they were taken up to the gods when they died and became immortal. Individual ascension, special privilege. Now, that I think I'm going to say is the wallpaper of the Mediterranean world. The Romans accepted it, the Greeks accepted it, the Jews accepted it. They said, Josephus and Philo both said Moses had been assumed into heaven, and of course Romulus was assumed into heaven for the Romans. The Pharisees, here's where I start shifting all the weight. The Pharisees said, in effect, well, that's fine. So individuals may, this individual or that may get a special privilege. What about the whole human race? What about universal responsibility? Now, their answer was at the end of time, the entire human race, bodily, bodily, would be raised up and everyone would see the judgment of the whole human race. Now, quite frankly, in case there's any mistakes here, if you take that literally, I consider it to be rubbish. If you take it as a parable of the responsibility of the human race, it sounds like the evening news. Because we're beginning to see the cumulative responsibility of the human race and what it's doing, and maybe making it that we're no longer a sustainable species. So universal resurrection is this at least intuition that the Pharisees had that individual recompense isn't enough. What about where is cosmic justice? Is there cosmic justice? And the assertion of the Pharisees was there is. Now, one more thing. Those are metaphors. Let me drumbeat. Of course, ascension is a metaphor. Do I ever think it happened literally? No. resurrection, metaphor. But here's the bite. Metaphors create reality. Ah, so if you live out a metaphor, because a metaphor is a way of seeing things, then you're creating reality. So, metaphors are the realest stuff around. Look at my example. Two lived communal metaphors from 1933. The Third Reich in Germany, the New Deal here. They're just metaphors. And then people start living accordingly. And some metaphors do not work. And some metaphors do. There have to be chains and all. But basically, so I take metaphor terribly, terribly seriously. Now, one final thing on when you talked about Psalm 22, all of that comes later. But I want to insist on one thing. When the first followers of Jesus started searching the scriptures, they were not looking for arguments. They were looking for survival. They were trying to see, is it possible? Dear God, is it possible that the Messiah might have been destined to be crucified? Now, they're not looking for the way people do with prophecies today and all that stuff. They're trying to see, wait a minute, the whole pattern of our history is suffering. The Psalms are filled with suffering. So Jesus isn't the first or the last Jew who died on a Roman cross or any cross. He is the climax of our suffering. Then he doesn't die alone. So when I get to describe Mark, when I get to describe how he died, and I haven't a clue, well, I know something about crucifixions, of course. What am I going to do? I'm going to fill it with quotations to show how he died as the climax of the suffering of his people. For example, I'm just taking one example. To divide my clothes among them, for my clothing they cast lot. Psalm 22, which is a poor person crying out to God, they've taken everything from me. They've taken everything. They've taken the shirt off my back. Now, along comes Mark. He quotes that. If you or I didn't know the psalm, we'd simply say, well, fair enough. That's probably what executioners would do. We go right through it as a piece of history. Ooh, they did that to Jesus. And Matthew copies it, same thing. Now look at John, who is much later, of course. John says it fulfills scripture. John's moving towards the fulfillment of scripture, and we're on the path towards proof and argumentation. But all that first stuff, when you're reading Mark, comes from early followers trying fervently to understand the death of Jesus within the history of their people. They're not making arguments. Eventually they will, and eventually they will do terribly, insufferably unfair argument because by the third century, by the fourth century, they'll be saying, if I may, very crude, look at those intransigent Jews who can't see that the Psalm even foretold what was going to happen to Jesus. They've gone full circle. They've taken it from the Psalms for their identity. Then they're battering the people of the Psalms because they're not seeing the prophecy. That, that's not the way you should do things. So in any case, my answer to your first question, and that's a long question, so I said a lot, I know. The option that Paul had was sort of the sayings of Jesus' wisdom, sort of things you get in Gospel of Thomas, of course, as well. And he didn't want it. That would never have convinced him. That would never have convinced him and didn't convince him. So we still haven't answered what did convince him. We're saying why this would never have convinced him, even if he knew it. Even if somebody had said to him, well, I don't know how he would have said it before Mark, because I don't think anyone was saying, he had divided his clothes. Did you know that? Paul would probably have said, yeah, that's what they always do at a crucifixion. So that would be the best I can do with your first question, Ed.
Alrighty, thank you for that. Okay, going into our second question. First Corinthians from Paul has an early creed that originated from a group of Christians about 3 years after Christ's death. It claims that Jesus appeared to many people, including 500 witnesses. So my question to you is, do you think any part of the verse is a later interpolation? And do you also believe 500 people actually thought they saw Jesus?
Okay, let me do the same thing I'm going to do. I'm going to try and put that in the general background of Paul on the crucifixion and resurrection, okay? Because as far as I'm concerned, if 500 people had a vision of Jesus, good for them. I'm not interested. I mean, thousands of people at Fatima saw the sun spinning. I'm absolutely convinced that that's what people do. If people were convinced, if only they went to the mall in Washington, they'd see the dome of the Capitol spin around, and if everything was right, I'm sure people would see it. It's the way we are. It's not even worth your while saying no. But is that what's going on in Paul? That's what I want. Is Paul built on 600 would be better? Wow, if he got 1,000, it'd be twice as good. So I'm going to open up again. I'm going to go to my share screen if I haven't lost it. I don't think I have. So let me look at this one. I want to focus on a term that Paul uses, which I think actually is where I see the beating heart of Paul, honestly. I think I can hear his heartbeat. It's the phrase, the mystery of God. Now, that sounds, oh, come on, that sounds like a redundancy. Of course, God's mysterious, big deal. No, no. He's talking about the mystery of what God did because it sears the very heart of Paul that from all eternity, this is Paul speaking, from all eternity, God knew that when the Messiah came, that's Paul's language, into the maelstrom of the Roman Empire, he'd be crucified. Now, why on earth did God send Paul at that moment? Why not, 50 years before, 50 years later? He tells the Corinthians. So I'm beginning at the beginning of Corinthians, the first chapter, first two chapters, and then I go to the 15th chapter on the resurrection, because for Paul, execution and resurrection are two sides of the one coin, if you will. Paul says, I speak wisdom. It is not the wisdom of the rulers of this age. Now, the rulers of this age do not mean anything fantastic. They mean Caesar and Company Limited, but not just as Romans. Paul knows the Assyrians would have done it, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Syrians, the whole imperial bunch of them would, might have crucified Jesus. And they're doomed to perish. They have no future. That we know today. So he says we speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden. This is the great secret. Why did God plan from all eternity, this is Paul speaking, that Jesus is going to be crucified? None of the rulers of this age, that's the second time he's moved that. This age is simply civilization in plain language. The rulers of this age understood this, of course, for if they had, they would certainly not have crucified the Lord of glory and revealed the savagery of their own injustice. So that's the way he sees crucifixion. And if you see crucifixion as vicarious atonement, just please, that's Anselm. It's not Paul. And if somebody says, well, I can't stand this crucifixion, of course, but crucifixion reveals the savage heart of civilization. That's what we have to face. And of course, we don't like it. Of course, we don't like it. And sometimes, if we're looking at the evening news, you might see the savage heart of our own civilization, and we still don't like it. But that's what Paul asks us to face. Now, let me look at the second one. We're going to 1 Corinthians 15. Let me look at Paul knows a tradition. Of course, we all say that. He has a piece of tradition. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt, not argue about it. The question is this: is Paul speaking about ascension and changing it into resurrection. Put absolutely bluntly, was it ascension before Paul got at it? And as a good Pharisee, he invented the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm talking very forcibly. That's my thesis. That's the thesis of the book. Before Paul, what you had was ascension. In other words, exactly what you would have expected. If now I'm asking you to imagine, this I do not think of, but if you imagine Easter Sunday and imagine that they had found the empty tomb, that's a separate issue, but imagine it for the moment, as if in a court of law you're saying dato non concesso. Why would they not have imagined the obvious that Jesus has been assumed into heaven by God? That's the obvious thing. The Romans would expect it. They mightn't believe it for Jesus, but they know it's possible. No Roman could tell Paul, you can't have an ascension. Of course you can. We might not believe your guy ascended, but Julius Caesar did, and so did Augustus. So yeah, it can be. But this resurrection stuff, Paul, so when Paul reads, he was raised, gyro is the Greek verb. It's a perfectly ordinary verb. It could be used for getting out of bed. He was raised on the third day. That sounds like an ascension. So watch what Paul does with it. And I put in the Greek, not just to show off I know Greek, because duh, you're supposed to do it. I want you to watch the verbs. Watch how he argues. And I want to insist that it's always when he says raised from the dead, it's plural. If you ask most people, what does it mean to be raised from the dead? They say, well, it happened to Jesus. He was raised from the dead. It's the dead ones. It's the necroi, the plural. He's not just raised from the dead as an individual, specific, special privilege. That's nonsense in the first century. The raising of the dead is a universal phenomenon. So now we're treading very dangerously. Paul is saying it's happened already? Wait a minute. Resurrection is supposed to happen. You're a good Pharisee and you know this. At the end of time? For everyone together? What do you mean, Paul, that it's happened for Jesus kind of ahead of time? So look at the Greek. If Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead ones, the Greek is ek nekron, genitive plural, agagortai. So you got the verb agairo. How can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead ones? Now we get the technical language. Anastasis nekron. That is always the phrase for the resurrection of the dead. Anastasis, anastemi, necron, genitive plural, always plural. So now we're working with two different verbs. And Paul is arguing they stand or fall together. You couldn't have a resurrection of Jesus without a resurrection of the dead. Couldn't have a resurrection of dead. Never does he mention a special privilege for Jesus to get resurrected. You can't do that. It's like if I use a word like the Senate, I'm not just talking of one person, I'm talking of collectivity. If there is no resurrection of the dead ones, anastasis necron, then Christ has not been a gyro.
Mhm.
So what he's going to argue, and this is actually stunning. I don't mean stunning whether you believe it or not, but stunning even to see is it even makes sense. Christ is the first fruits of those who have died, the first fruits of those who have slept. So Paul is claiming the resurrection has begun. What on earth? Then, Paul, are we supposed to be leading resurrected lives? What do you mean? And Paul would, of course, say, well, it's not all over yet, but yes. Because for Paul, I think I'm going to, for Paul, the same way that execution reveals the savage heart of civilization, resurrection reveals the just heart of God. If the Messiah was executed and thereby revealed, maybe that we're not a sustainable species because of our violence, then the other side of that is the justice of God. So injustice of civilization, justice of creation. So I'm arguing that Paul is the first one who insisted on the resurrection of Jesus and would never have accepted the ascension of Jesus. And if he heard, and probably did, by the way, at an early stage, people talking about the ascension of Jesus, I don't know for sure because it's not in Q. Q simply imagines that Jesus is the wisdom of God come down to earth and has gone back. Q knows he was executed, of course. So let me look at just not proofs, but something to think about. The first text of Jesus' vindication, I'm now using a neutral term. Vindication could be ascension, vindication could be resurrection. The transfiguration is an ascension text. An ascension text. You know that because it has Elijah and Moses there kind of to receive Jesus as a welcoming committee there in heaven already. And you can see that the look down on earth, the on the ground below, the Peter, James, and John are terrified. And here's the giveaway. At the top of the mountain, as it were, you have an ascension. At the bottom, you have a resurrection. He ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until Son of Man had risen from the dead, ek, nekron, anastay, exactly what you'd expect. That's Mark turning the ascension visibly before your eyes into a resurrection. And preparing, of course, for what he will do in 16:1 to 8. This would have been a perfectly at home resurrection, ascension by itself. Now, let me look at one other one. That's the first text we get. Here's the first image we have. The very first image, the date is 400. Look at it to the left. You see the tomb. You see the women coming to the tomb. You see the soldiers asleep. You see the angel telling them. So it looks like a classical resurrection, empty tomb. But then look what's happening to Jesus. He's ascending. The hand of God is coming down out of the sky to give him a lift. He's climbing up the mountain, as it were. It's the same general background as the transfiguration. And the disciples are kind of terrified. So it's kind of the transfiguration and the ascension, as it were. So I'm arguing, and this is what serious discussion should involve. If we're getting into Paul, not in the past and saying the same stuff over and over again, but trying to think Paul into the future. I think before Paul, before Paul got working on this, and the only reason I think Paul would have taken it, let me think like Paul. I am a Pharisee. I believe in the general resurrection. Oh, if Jesus started the general resurrection, then I am a messianic Christique. He's not a Christian, by the way, a Christique, like a messianic Christique. That's how Paul can shift from one to the other. It's the pivot, if you will, the pivot from being a non-messianic Christic persecutor to being a messianic Christic apostle. The pivot is resurrection. Paul can say to himself, so Phariseeism was right. It just has to recognize the resurrection has begun with Jesus.
All righty. Thank you very much for that. That was very informative. All right. Going into another question about Paul. So we're gonna be going into your favorite and going into Acts. So Do you think Paul being brought up to Christian leaders in Acts and being called out by them for allegedly abandoning the law of Moses, since by that time Paul was teaching that no one needed to be circumcised to become a Christian and all one needed to be saved was to repent and believe in Jesus? Do you think that that whole event is historical? And then the follow-up question would be, why would Christians think was preaching error if he was an inspired apostle proved of by Peter?
And okay, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take that into a wider matrix. And I think there was one other question here, so I'll skip down past it to what I want to do here. I want to put this whole thing about the letters of Paul and the relationship with Peter in a wider frame of reference, okay? Because what Luke Acts does quite clearly is establish the ascendancy of Peter over Paul. That's what's going on. So every little bit that we ask about, I'm filling it out within that matrix. The matrix is that Paul, if I ask who's afraid of the big bad Paul, most of the New Testament, Paul scares the living daylights out of them. And he should, because he's right. Paul is not a liberal. Paul is a radical. That means his vision of the future is correct. The liberal vision of the future is not adequate. It's certainly better than the conservative one, but it's not enough. It's not enough to sustain our species. So let me look at this real fast to set it up. You have the radical apostle Paul, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, you know that. And the 7 letters that are the authentic letters. Now you get the conservative apostle, pseudo Paul, in Colossians and Ephesians. Wives, be subject to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Now, it's conservative because at least he addresses wives, he addresses husbands, he addresses slaves. Roman paterfamilias would say, don't you dare talk to my wife. You tell me and I'll tell her. Don't you dare talk to my slaves. I will address them. You'll address me and I'll address them. Now, you get that in the reactionary Paul of Timothy and Titus. Let a woman, he's not addressing them. He doesn't say women, wives be subject. Let a woman learn in silence. He's telling the husbands to tell them. That's reactionary. The same thing. Tell slaves to be submissive. That's reactionary. It's reaction beyond the conservative. Now look over at the conservative apostle Peter. Peter, this is the letters of Peter. First of all, slaves come up first. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference. At least he addresses them too, by the way. Not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. And he mentions that first because good old Aristotle says the model for the home is the model between the slave and the master, so that husband to wife, parent to child is modeled on the basic one in the home, which is master to slave, which I think is awful. And I think it's dumb, to be honest with you, because he knows right well, Aristotle knows right well, that you could be taken a captive in a war and enslaved, no matter. Then Aristotle's answer is, well, you're naturally a slave and just got caught up in the war. Rubbish. Wives be subject in the same way husbands. So what you have is a whole process of Paul being, I'm going to use the term as a pun, petrified. He's Peterized, as it were. Peter is going to be the model. Paul's a problem because unfortunately the letters are there already and you can't get rid of them. So let me look at what Luke Acts does to it. For Paul, of course, he insists, I'm an apostle. I've seen the Lord. And Luke says, no. He was knocked to the ground blind. Well, if you're blind, you can't see the Lord. A blinding light is a lovely revelation, but this is a hatchet job on Paul. You're blind. Look at them in the image there. You're on the ground. Christ might be appearing, but you ain't seeing. And in fact, you don't even recognize the voice. Who are you, Lord? Boy, that's pretty dumb. Most of us are knocked to the ground by Christ. You might just have a clue who they might be and say, "Excuse me, Lord," or, "Sorry about all that." Anyway, look at this, though, even more so. All the events in the Acts, everything that happens to Paul happens to Peter beforehand. Preach to Jews, preach to Gentiles, heal a lame man, exorcise the demon, escape a prison, defeat a magician, raise a dead person. Good old Peter got in there first. Okay, Paul got there too. I love those two images. They're from Palermo. In one case, the one on the left, Paul is kind of a bit to the front. You see, he's almost in front of Peter.
Oh, yeah.
And then over on the one on the right, he's kind of behind Peter, saying, "What's going on, please? Could you tell me what's going on? I haven't a clue." If you read Acts carefully, the ascendancy is of Peter over Paul. Let me give you another example. Look at these images, by the way. The first centuries are riddled with images of Peter embracing Paul. Look at the arms. Well, you could say Paul is embracing Peter, of course, but look whose arms are on the outside. Peter is in charge, okay? So they have to be reconciled because they're going to be the hero twins of Christian Rome, like Romulus and Remus. You won't get into, who killed whom or anything like that. So Peter is the apostle of the nations. The event is told in Acts 10. He reports it in Jerusalem in Acts 11. He reports it again in the first person. God has chosen me in Acts 15. Oh, yeah. Paul gets his three times too. When it happens, his report in Acts 22, report in Acts 26. But Peter again has three accounts. And he says in Acts 15, "I was the one chosen by God to bring in the Gentiles." This is the unkindest cut of all. Paul, for Luke Acts, is not the apostle of the Gentiles. He's a great apostle, of course, sent by the Jerusalem church and checking in regularly to headquarters. Okay, let me look at one final one. This is an image from Monreale Cathedral in near Palermo in Italy. Thank you, Sarah, by the way, for it. Uh, Again, the embrace again, and you see Peter that has the outside arms that you recognize Paul because he's kind of bald. There's witnesses there. See, Paul has a kind of a servant with him, and Peter has it because this has to be witnessed. This is very important. So this is witnessed, but the caption above is much higher, so I wasn't able to keep it in. The caption in Latin reads, "Hic here in the picture, Paul comes to Rome and makes peace with Peter." So Peter is ensconced in Rome already, and Paul has to travel to Rome and make peace with Peter. So that's the great, what I call petrification. And that's what's going on. Is
Yeah.
making Peter in charge. So within that, and it's not Paul. And you wouldn't have to do it to Paul if Paul wasn't Paul. So I find all of this confirms for me more than any working on the syntax and the the grammar of Colossians and Ephesians and whether it's different from the grammar of Romans and Galatians. If that was all we had, I could be maybe persuaded that Paul's got a new secretary with a maybe better Greek or something, and he's an old man and getting tired and he's letting them do the writing. But it's all of this process from beginning to end of the downgrading of Paul, of which the pseudo-Pauline letters is just part. This embracing of Peter and Paul is the real climax of the whole thing. So we get the two apostles in Rome, and we have our new Christian Romulus and Remus, and we're off and running. ready for Constantine.
Alrighty,
Anything
thank.
else?
Oh yes, I did have one last question. This one's about Jesus. So, do you think that the historical Jesus thought he was an eternal divine being like the Father that created all things in the universe? And if not, how do you think the four accounts of the Gospels portraying Jesus as God? Think of Thomas's declaration, "My Lord and my God." How do you think that came to evolve as they did?
Okay, and I did, that was actually your third one, so I did have something to think about this. And what I'm doing with all of these is they'll be available if you want to make them in any way available, of course, to your constituency. I want them to be able to see this as well as hear it. This is the image that I used. And I ask you just to look at it for a moment. Paul's in the middle, and all he's got going for him is a scroll. If Paul had simply been talking, an orator, we wouldn't have any of this problem. He'd have been quietly elided. He'd been absorbed into Luke Acts, and Luke Acts would tell us a home cleaned up Paul, and we'd have no problems. Paul got his letters in there first, and they couldn't get rid of them. They could do all sorts of stuff with them. They could interpolate them. They could pseudo Paul. But look at the two images. Please go back to the first century. Before you ask Constantine and 324, look at the first century. That's Caesar. It's a magnificent statue, as you know, from St. Petersburg, from the Hermitage. But look, the bronze stuff is long gone, of course. But look what he's got. He's got the scepter, which is the ritual remnant of the spear in his left hand. The spear, because that goes back before the sword. The spear is the symbol of conquest. His other hand, his right hand, holds the orb. And on the orb, of course, is victory. And Sarah put it back on there because it's not on the one, of course, in the Hermitage. We saw it. It's actually on Zeus and the adjacent bay, but it's not there. So we put it on, and it should be facing him, but we kind of compromised and made it half facing us, half facing him. He's She is crowning him as the conqueror of the world by force. That's the Roman vision. Now look at Jesus. What's he got going for him? His left hand's on a book. Call it the Bible or the Gospel, whichever. And he's not reading it because he is the subject. He doesn't have to read it. He's the norm of the book. You never see him reading the book. It might be open towards us. And his right hand is blessing the world. The left hand holds the book. This is the symbol of persuasion. It's the power of persuasion over against the power of force. These are transcendental forces in the world, like the tectonic plates of history. They're called divine because they're transcendental. And by transcendental, if you want another example of it, evolution is transcendental. In other words, we ain't running it. That's what I mean by transcendental. We can we can run the traffic system, we can turn it to the British system if we want to go crazy. We can do it. It's not transcendental. We made it, we can unmake it. But transcendental is what you can live with, but you can't control. That's what divine means as far as I'm concerned. Transcendental. Now, look at the next image. The common titles of Caesar the Augustus, that's his title, Jesus the Christ. These are common titles that I found either in Augustan poetry or in inscriptions. Redeemer from sin, Savior of the world, God from God, new creator, creator of a new world, Son of God, Lord God. Now, how on earth can those apply to Caesar on the Palatine Hill in Rome and Jesus on the Nazareth Ridge in Galilee? And I've tried to give two images that were relatively neutral there, just different clothes, but at least no spears or anything. Here's how I understand it. Caesar, his motto, I'm quoting him now, actually quoting Caesar, yeah, Augustus, of course. In 31, when he put up the monument after the great victory, the Axiom over Antony and Cleopatra, and established himself for all practical purposes as Augustus, he says, Pace parta terra marique. It's got a lovely rhythm in that. Pace parta terra marique. Peace established on land and sea. And then on his bronze tombstone, you might say, in the field of Mars in Rome, he asked to say what he had done as part of victoriis pax, peace established by victories. Of course, that's the motto of civilization. It's the motto of the Roman Empire. And they would say without apologies, do you ever get victory any other way? Do you think the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Greeks, peace established by victory? Their sequence of imperial theology is religion. First of all, you get religion. So the gods are on your side. Then you go to war. With the gods on your side, you get victory. And then you get peace. Then you get peace. Now, what's the counter? Even to establish there is a counter coming out of the Old Testament, the Torah, the prophets, wisdom, into Jesus and Paul. You get peace through distributive justice when everyone gets a fair share of the stuff of the world. They would have said it's terribly simple. The motto of Jewish messianic Christic, notice I'm not using Christian, that they don't exist yet, Christic theology, religion, nonviolence, justice, and peace. Or as John says, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not the peace of the world. So wait a minute. There's two pieces on earth feuding with one another. So let me go with the final image. I ask you to try and imagine the Council of Nicaea, 324. First of all, it's held at Constantine's beautiful lakeside summer villa on Lake Nicaea. It's Lake Iznik today, and it's a gorgeous lake. It's not built up at all. We usually, in the Crossan pilgrimages, we usually got there from Basra, about 9 or 10 in the morning, and it looked like a Chinese art, magnificent lake. So the bishops are invited to come to the royal palace, maybe 25 bishops, whatever, and they have to decide about the divinity of Christ. Now, please forget everything for a moment. You're being invited to come to sit down with the emperor who is divine. Do you think it stopped when he became Christian? He's been divine for 300 years. That was your problem. Now you're going to say, well, when he was pagan and divine, we had a problem. But now that he's Christian and divine, we got no problem because you still have Jesus. So Jesus is divine and Constantine is divine. They both got halos. So we have to come and we have to figure out how Jesus is bigger. He's more divine than Constantine and preferably not get crucified. Because look at that image. That's from a church in Romania. Again, thank you, Sarah. Church in Romania. And I love it because, see Constantine, he's in a nice big throne, higher up than everyone else. He's got a halo, by the way. Behind him, look at his courtiers. And behind the courtiers are the guard. And way up there in the middle of all those spears, you can blow it up if you can, you see Christ. Oh, he's there. But he looks like he's impaled on the spears of the guard. Down on the floor is poor Aularius. Now, look at the rescript. It comes from the bishops on the left of your screen, arcs up over Constantine's knees, so he checks it out, as it were, and then over to the scribe. That is perfectly accurate. So your problem, and I ask any theologian today to try it to see if they can do better. We're going to do it in Greek, and we're going to try and confuse Constantine so he doesn't have a clue what's going on. We'll talk about Uzia, and he's going to be rather woozy over all this oozy. So he won't know that what we're saying is Jesus is much more divine than you are, Buster. That's what we're going to say. But now we have to do it in language. So we'll say consubstantial with the Father. He won't have a clue what it means. We're not sure. We know what it means exactly, but it means he isn't. What Jesus is, you ain't. And we've said it in a way that you can't. The term oozy is substance. You and I use substance in a similar sense when we say, well, this book is substantially the same thing as the other. It means the core of it, the heart of it, the gist of it is the same. We also use substance for my computer's on a table here, and it's quite substantial, meaning solid. It's not so much that substantial as meaning the core of it. So what we're saying, what Jesus really is the Father, excuse me, is God in sandals. We're making the claim as Christians, of course, that if you want to see God, for us, the best shot you have is Jesus. Now, you say, oh, wait a minute, excuse me, Jesus ain't around anymore. Ah, that's why you have the Spirit. Oh, so nobody can see God, right? But we can see God in Jesus, but Jesus is gone, so we have the Spirit. I mean, the Trinity is inevitable. It's not just Christian. I mean, it's almost true of any religion. You're the referent of your religion you can't see, but you find it in something. And you may find it in a herd of buffalo roaring across the plains. So please understand what they're trying to say is how is Jesus for us God in sandals? This is our best shot. There might be other people for other people. Fine, fine. We're not talking to other people. At least we shouldn't be. Other people must make their own decision. They must say where they find transcendence. And if they say we don't find it anywhere, then they have to live with that because they will find it somewhere. Oh, yeah. If you don't have it, you'll have it in business or in commerce or in mammon or in war, but you'll have it because we've always had it. So I'd ask people to try and understand Nicaea. The problem was to get home in one piece and to make certain that Jesus was more divine than Con. And of course, once all of this was explained to Constantine, of course he went Arian. I would if I was Constantine. I wouldn't like that once it was explained to me. Now, you see, Your Imperial Highness, you were blindsided. Hmm? Tell me again. Tell me all this oozy stuff. So
Hmm.
I don't know if you could do any better. Now, if you're going to start persecuting people because of this, that's a whole different issue. That's a very different issue. But to be able to say what you mean, that Jesus is divine for me in a way the emperor never will be. Yep, I think that's right. Holds for presidents too. Jesus is divine in a way a ruler can never be. So that would be my answer to what they're trying to do. Did Jesus go around saying, "Me, of course not. Of course not." But he is making a claim, to be fair, that this is what God's about. And if you pushed him and said, "Well, you kind of mean, Jesus, that the way you're living and the way we should be living too is like God. So if I live like you, Jesus, am I living like a yes? Are you more godlike than me? Let me see your life. Can we all be godlike? Of course. I don't think Jesus would have said, read Romans chapter 8, but it's all there.
Yeah. Alrighty. Thank you for answering those questions. That was a very good discussion. Alrighty. Well, thanks again for coming on. And in a couple of minutes, I will have this uploaded on my YouTube channel, and you can share it with friends and family if you like.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Ed. Pleasure to
Thank
be
you.
with you. And
Nice seeing
goodbye
you.
to all your viewers.
Alrighty. See ya.